The furnace had been burning since before dawn, its breath thick and black, coughing smoke into a sky that no longer bothered to look blue. Cold dust clung to the air like a second skin, settling into lungs, hair, and the creases of prayer-worn hands. On the plantation outside Lima, fire was not feared. It was obeyed. It cooked the sugar, hardened the iron, and erased whatever screamed too loudly after sunset. Esperanza stood barefoot on the stone floor, her toes numb despite the heat, counting the seconds between the furnace's low, animal groans. Each sound told her how hungry it was. Each tremor in the iron door told her how much more it could take. She had learned to read fire the way others read scripture. Not because she wanted to, but because survival demanded fluency. No one remembered when she arrived at the plantation. Slaves rarely arrived with birthdays or proper names, only scars and the weight of someone else's profit. But everyone remembered the night she stopped crying. She had been a child then, pressed against a wall while men argued outside the furnace room. She remembered the smell first: hair, oil, flesh, before she understood what fire could do to a human body sealed behind iron. The screaming had not lasted long. The silence afterward lasted forever. By 1716, Esperanza was a woman carved thin by labor and patience. The owners trusted her because she did not look at them when they spoke, because she moved when commanded, because her hands never shook when feeding coal into the furnace's mouth. They believed fear had hollowed her out. They were wrong. Fire had filled her instead. At night, when the plantation slept, Esperanza listened to the furnace cool, its metal ticking like bones settling after death. She learned how long iron stayed hot. She learned how sound died inside brick walls. She learned that smoke rose straight when the air was still, and how long it took before anyone questioned the smell. The owners drank heavily in those days. Rum loosened their tongues and dulled their instincts. They spoke of wealth and discipline and God, always God, as if heaven were a ledger that balanced itself. They never noticed how Esperanza watched the furnace doors when they passed, or how her fingers lingered on the latches just a moment too long. The first man disappeared during harvest season. They called it an accident, a stumble, a drunkard's mistake. When they found what remained of him, there was not enough left to bury properly. The furnace had been especially hungry that night. By the time the whispers started, it was already too late. Fire does not rush, it waits. And Esperanza had been waiting her entire life. Esperanza was 7 when the plantation decided to teach her what fire meant. The night had begun quietly, too quietly for a place that thrived on noise and command. She had been pulled from the sleeping quarters by a hand that smelled of rum and iron, her feet scraping the dirt as she was dragged toward the furnace building. She did not understand where she was going, only that the air grew warmer with every step, heavy and bitter, like the world itself was burning somewhere just out of sight. Inside, the walls were blackened with years of smoke, and the floor was slick with ash pressed flat by countless feet that had learned not to hesitate. They locked her in a corner, not inside the furnace, but close enough that she could feel its breath. Another woman was already there, older, wrists bound, her mouth bloodied from begging. Esperanza recognized her voice before she saw her face. It was the same voice that hummed while working, the same voice that once whispered stories about oceans that never ended. That voice broke when the iron door opened. The sound of metal screaming against metal cut through the room, sharper than any cry. No one explained what was happening. Explanations were for people whose lives mattered. Esperanza was forced to watch as the woman was shoved forward, her body resisting until resistance became pointless. The furnace roared when it was fed, flames leaping as if alive, eager. Heat flooded the room, pressing against Esperanza's skin until her eyes watered and her chest burned. When the door slammed shut, the screaming began, wild and desperate at first, then rhythmic, then wrong. Esperanza counted the screams without knowing why, counting because stopping felt like dying. The men laughed nervously, uncomfortable with the sound, but unwilling to stop it. Someone said it was necessary. Someone else said it would teach the others obedience. Esperanza learned something else entirely. She learned that fire erased rules, erased names, erased even memory if it burned long enough. She learned that walls could hide murder, that smoke carried truth upward while lies stayed below. When the screaming ended, the silence pressed harder than the heat. A silence filled with the crackle of burning coal and the soft settling of something that had been alive moments before. They left Esperanza there until morning. No comfort, no words, just the furnace cooling beside her, ticking and sighing like a creature satisfied. When they finally unlocked the door, she walked out without crying, without looking back, her mind no longer occupied by fear, but by understanding. Fire was not chaos. Fire was order. Fire listened to those who knew how to feed it, how to close the door, how to wait just long enough. Years passed, measured not in seasons, but in scars, and the slow reshaping of Esperanza's body into something lean and uncomplaining. By the time she was assigned to the furnace, she had learned how to disappear in plain sight, how to move without drawing attention, how to keep her eyes lowered while her mind stayed sharp. The overseer believed the work would break her. Instead, it gave her access. The furnace house became her world, a place others avoided, a place where heat drove away conversation and conscience alike. She learned the language of the machinery through repetition. The weight of coal in her hands told her how long the fire would burn. The color of the flames revealed whether the heat was climbing or dying. She noticed how the iron door swelled when hot, how it resisted opening from the inside once sealed, how the latch slipped more easily when turned with steady pressure rather than force. These were not lessons taught aloud. They were absorbed, carved into her through hours of labor, while sweat ran down her spine and ash coated her tongue. At first, she did not think of using the furnace for anything other than what it was meant to do. Survival left little room for imagination. But one afternoon, as she shoveled coal while two plantation owners argued nearby, one of them struck a laborer and threatened to throw him into the fire as an example. The threat was spoken lightly, almost jokingly, and the man laughed when the laborer flinched. Esperanza's hands paused for a fraction of a second. In that pause, memory surged back. The screams, the silence, the ticking iron. The threat was not a metaphor. It was a promise they believed they could keep. That night, she stayed after the others left, pretending to clean. Alone with the furnace, she tested what she had noticed. She closed the iron door and pushed against it from the inside, feeling how the heat transformed it into a wall that would not yield. She tested the latch, listening to the click that sounded small but final. She counted the minutes it took for the air to grow thin, for breathing to become painful even without flame. Each experiment was done quietly, carefully leaving no trace but knowledge. The realization settled slowly, like ash. The furnace was not just a tool of punishment. It was private. It was efficient. It devoured sound and returned nothing recognizable. Accidents were common on plantations. Men disappeared. Stories changed. Bones became dust. Esperanza understood that the fire did not care who fed it. It responded only to preparation and patience. From that moment on, every time an owner passed her in the furnace house, she measured them not by their cruelty, but by their weight, by how long it would take the iron to seal, by how completely the fire could be trusted to finish What it began, the disappearances, did not announce themselves. They seeped into the plantations the way smoke seeped into clothing. Subtle at first, easily dismissed. One owner failed to return from a late inspection. Another was found dead near a furnace, with no witnesses and too much heat damage to ask questions of the body. The word accident traveled faster than truth ever could, carried by men who needed to believe it. Sugar production could not stop for rumors, and fear was easier to manage when given a harmless name. Esperanza heard the whispers, long before they reached the owner's tables. They moved through the laborers' quarters in fragments, broken sentences exchanged at night, eyes darting even in darkness. Some said the fire was angry. Some said the spirits of the burned were pulling men into the flames. Others said nothing at all, choosing silence because silence had kept them alive this long. Esperanza listened without reacting, her face calm, her movements unchanged. She understood that a secret only survives when it appears to belong to everyone and no one at once. She never spoke of what she had done, not even in hints. The furnace house did the speaking for her. It coughed differently on certain mornings, carried a heavier smell that lingered in the air despite fresh coal. Ash collected in unfamiliar patterns, darker, thicker. She learned how to erase signs before anyone important noticed, how to scatter remains among the waste, how to time each act so it blended into routine. Fire was thorough, but it still required guidance. Esperanza provided it. The network formed without meetings, without leaders, without names. A woman would leave a door unlocked at the right moment. A boy would fail to ring a bell until it was too late. A man would claim he saw nothing because seeing would have demanded intervention. Each person believed they were acting alone, driven by fear or chance, and that belief protected them. Esperanza never asked for help. She only allowed space for choice. Those who understood stepped into it. Owners grew uneasy. They drank less in the furnace house, joked less about punishment. They began traveling in pairs, then groups, but groups created confidence, and confidence made them careless. Esperanza watched them gather, watched how their laughter filled the furnace room when they visited, how they treated the heat as a spectacle, not a threat. They believed ownership extended to fire itself. They believed nothing on the plantation could turn against them without warning. One afternoon, a foreman questioned Esperanza about the furnaces. His tone was sharp, his eyes searching. She answered simply, her voice steady, explaining temperatures, coal usage, maintenance. She spoke with the authority of someone who worked where others feared to stand. The foreman nodded, reassured by her usefulness. That was the danger of efficiency. It made people invisible. When he left, Esperanza noticed his hands were shaking. As the disappearances continued, the stories grew louder. Ships arriving at the port carried rumors from other plantations, half-formed tales of men burned alive, of furnaces that ate masters instead of slaves. The church attempted explanations, sermons about divine punishment and earthly tests. The owners listened politely and then returned to business. Faith was a comfort, not a warning. Esperanza began to notice who sensed the truth. Some laborers avoided the furnace house entirely now, crossing themselves when passing. Others lingered nearby, pretending to work, watching the doors. Their eyes followed Esperanza with something close to reverence, though she discouraged it by remaining distant. She did not want belief. Belief created martyrs. She wanted uncertainty. Uncertainty made people cautious. There were nights when she heard crying outside the quarters. Grief for men who had never been mourned before. Wives arrived, demanding answers, demanding bodies. They were given ashes and excuses. Esperanza watched from a distance, unmoved by the performances of sorrow. She had learned long ago that grief did not distinguish between the innocent And the guilty? It simply existed, heavy and endless. She carried her own and did not need to add theirs. The owners held meetings behind closed doors, discussing safety, discipline, retribution. Punishments increased, whippings became more public, warnings more severe. They believed fear would restore order. Instead, it sharpened it. Every scream reminded the laborers of the furnace's appetite. Every punishment proved the owner's belief that fire was an acceptable answer. Esperanza understood that they were teaching the lesson themselves, reinforcing it with every act of cruelty. By the time the third plantation reported a death too burned to identify, the secret was no longer whether someone was doing this, but how many would follow. Esperanza felt the shift like a change in weather. The furnace house seemed smaller now, tighter, as if drawing breath. She adjusted her routines, slowed her actions, allowed weeks to pass between moments. Fire did not need to be rushed. It thrived on anticipation. She sensed eyes on her more often, curiosity mixed with suspicion, but suspicion without proof is a weak thing. She gave them nothing. She worked. She obeyed. She waited. The network continued without her guidance, small acts aligning by instinct rather than plan. In the dark, people dreamed differently now. Some dreamed of escape. Some dreamed of revenge. Some dreamed of fire not as an enemy, but as an equal force, one that could be turned if approached the right way. Betrayal rarely arrives with drama. It comes quietly, disguised as fear, wrapped in the same survival instincts that once made loyalty possible. Esperanza sensed it before she understood it. A subtle tightening in the air around her, the way conversation stopped when she entered a space, the way certain eyes no longer looked away fast enough. Someone had begun to speak, not loudly, not with certainty, but enough to shift attention, enough to suggest that accidents might have a source. It was a boy who cracked first. Barely old enough to be trusted with tools, he had once delayed a bell on her behalf, pretending his hands were numb from cold. Esperanza had noticed, had nodded once, nothing more. Gratitude was dangerous. When the overseers questioned him, after another disappearance, they promised protection, food, lighter work. They told him fear could be forgiven if honesty followed it. He did not give her name, not directly. He said only that the furnace house knew more than it should, that some people understood fire too well. It was enough. The scrutiny intensified. The owners demanded inspections, brought in men unfamiliar with the furnaces. Men who poked and measured without understanding what they touched. Esperanza adjusted, answering questions, demonstrating processes, allowing herself to be watched. The trick was to appear nervous without appearing guilty. She let her hands tremble slightly when addressed, let her voice falter just enough to confirm their expectations. They wanted weakness. She gave them a performance. One owner, however, did not accept it. He had lost a brother to the fire weeks earlier, a man found fused to iron, his identity confirmed only by a ring warped beyond recognition. Grief sharpened his instincts. He followed Esperanza one night, far enough to see her pause at the furnace doors after finishing her work, far enough to see her place her palm flat against the cooling metal, as if listening. He did not confront her. He invited her to speak later, privately, offering protection in exchange for truth. His voice carried confidence, the certainty of someone who believed himself reasonable. Esperanza refused without saying no. She said nothing at all, lowered her eyes, returned to her quarters. Silence angered him more than denial would have. He began to speak openly among the others, suggesting a trap, a test to draw the truth into the open. Fear made them receptive. 14 owners agreed to gather at one plantation, under the pretense of discussing furnace safety, discipline, and the growing unrest. They chose the largest furnace house, believing numbers would shield them. They believed the threat, if real, would not dare reveal itself in daylight, surrounded by power. Esperanza learned of the meeting through absence. Too many laborers reassigned, too many furnaces left unlit elsewhere. Too much preparation for one place. The network whispered again, fragmented and urgent. Some warned her to hide. Some urged her to run. One woman pressed a small bundle of food into her hands without explanation, tears streaking her face. Esperanza understood then that mercy had limits. If she fled, the fire would find other hands, less careful, more reckless. The furnace would remain, and the lesson would be unfinished. She spent the night before the gathering preparing the furnace, as she always did, but with greater care. Coals stacked precisely. Vents adjusted to pull air inward once the doors were sealed. Tools placed where they could not be easily reached from inside. Every detail was checked twice, not from anxiety, but from respect. Fire demanded respect. She did not sleep. She sat against the brick wall, feeling the furnace breathe, steady and patient. The owners arrived mid-morning, voices loud, boots echoing against stone. They laughed at the heat, mocked the superstition surrounding the place. Esperanza served them as instructed, feeding the furnace, explaining its function, answering questions with practiced obedience. One by one, they stepped closer, peering inside, arguing about temperatures and costs. The grieving brother watched her constantly, waiting for a mistake, a sign. He never noticed when the doors shifted behind him. The moment itself was unremarkable. No speech, no declaration. Esperanza closed the furnace doors as she had thousands of times before. The latch fell into place with a sound too small to matter until it did. Shouts followed, then confusion, then the realization that iron did not yield to fists. Some tried to force the doors. Others screamed for guards. The furnace answered them all the same way, with rising heat and consuming noise. Esperanza did not run. She stood where she was, feeding the fire as instructed, as expected, as trained. The screaming lasted longer this time. 14 voices collided, overlapped, dissolved. Smoke poured upward, visible across the plantation. Laborers froze where they stood, understanding without explanation. No one intervened. No one could. When the noise finally faded, the furnace continued to burn, indifferent to numbers, satisfied only by completion. By the time guards arrived, it was already too late to separate accident from intent. The furnace had done its work too well. Esperanza remained beside it, ash streaking her skin, her expression empty. She did not deny anything. She did not confess. She had learned long ago that fire speaks more clearly than words. The aftermath did not explode the way stories later claimed it did. There was no immediate justice, no swift execution, no mob demanding blood. What followed was slower, heavier, like smoke that refuses to lift. 14 owners, reduced to ash, could not simply vanish without consequence. But neither could the truth be allowed to stand uncovered. The plantation froze into an unnatural stillness, work continuing out of habit rather than command. Guards watched everyone and no one, uncertain where authority now lived. The furnace house was sealed, then unsealed, then guarded again, its presence impossible to erase, without dismantling the very system that depended on it. Esperanza was taken but not beaten. Not yet. They bound her wrists gently, almost respectfully, as if force itself had grown unsure. She walked without resistance, her feet steady, her gaze forward. The men escorting her avoided the furnace, avoided her eyes, avoided speaking her name. A woman who did not flee confused them more than one who begged. In their silence, Esperanza understood that fear had shifted direction. It no longer flowed downward alone. Interrogations followed, circular and hollow. Questions repeated themselves, changing tone but not meaning. Who helped you? Why did you do it? Do you understand what you've done? Esperanza answered none of them. Silence had become her final discipline, refined over years of watching words twisted into weapons. They tried threats next, describing punishments they believed unbearable. She listened without reaction. Fire had already taught her the worst language pain could speak. The problem was not proving her guilt. The problem was deciding what her guilt meant. To execute her publicly would require acknowledging that 14 powerful men had been killed deliberately, not by accident or divine will. To keep her alive was to risk stories spreading beyond control. The church argued one thing. The traitors argued another. The crown, distant and slow, offered no immediate instruction. While they debated, Esperanza waited, confined but untouched, her presence pressing on the plantation like a held breath. Outside, the story was already mutating. Laborers whispered her name at night, cautiously at first, then with growing certainty. Esperanza de Lima, spoken like a warning and a prayer. Some said she had made a pact with fire itself. Others said the furnace obeyed her, because it recognized suffering. The details shifted with each telling, but the core remained unchanged. The fire had turned, and it had not turned back. That knowledge traveled faster than any official decree. Days stretched into weeks. No replacement owners arrived. Production slowed. Fear crept upward into places it had never been allowed. Overseers hesitated before issuing punishments near the furnace. Some refused to enter the building at all. Fire, once their most obedient tool, now felt like an observer. Esperanza sensed this even from confinement. Power did not require movement anymore. It radiated outward, fed by absence, by uncertainty, by the unanswered question of what might happen next. When the decision finally came, it was quiet. No trial. No public spectacle. They would erase her the way they erased others, but differently, more carefully. Official records would list her death as illness, exhaustion, an unfortunate inevitability. Her body would not be returned to the furnace. Fire had already given enough. Instead, they planned a grave no one would mark, a conclusion without witness. Order would be restored by pretending nothing had changed. On the morning it was meant to happen, Esperanza was taken out before dawn. The air was cool, carrying the distant smell of coal and wet earth. She walked between two guards whose hands shook more than hers ever had. As they passed the furnace house, she felt it even before she saw it, the low hum of stored heat, the quiet patience of iron and brick. She did not look at it. She did not need to. What she had placed there could not be undone. They stopped near the edge of the plantation, where the land dropped into scrub and shadow. No prayers were offered, no words spoken. When they raised their weapons, a sound rose behind them, faint at first, then unmistakable. Smoke, thin and dark, curling into the sky. Someone had opened the furnace. Someone had fed it. The guards hesitated, turning toward the signal of danger, of memory, of unfinished fear. In that hesitation, Esperanza understood her final choice had already been made long ago. Legend required sacrifice. Survival would only dilute the meaning. Whether she died there or later mattered less than what endured. She did not run when the confusion spread. She did not plead when hands grabbed her again. Her story no longer depended on her body. By the time order was restored, Esperanza was gone. Whether dead or escaped, no one could say with certainty. Records contradicted each other. Witnesses changed their accounts. What remained was the furnace, still standing, still necessary, still feared. Children grew up hearing warnings about fire that were no longer empty threats. Owners learned to look twice at iron doors, to listen for sounds they once ignored. The plantation survived, but it never fully recovered its certainty. Years later, when travelers passed through and asked about the place where 14 men burned, answers varied. Some said it was a myth. Some said it was justice. Some said fire remembers those who feed it too well. Esperanza de Lima became less a woman than a boundary, a reminder etched into brick and smoke, proof that even the most controlled flames can be taught to choose, and that once chosen, they do not forget. In the years that followed, the plantation remained, but it existed like a scar rather than a place. Crops still grew, furnaces still burned, and labor still bent beneath the sun. Yet something essential had been stripped away. The owners who replaced the dead ones spoke more softly near the furnace house. They avoided standing too close to the doors, avoided lingering when the fire was fed. Iron was treated with caution now, as if it possessed a memory that could be awakened without warning. No official grave ever bore Esperanza's name. Some swore she was buried beyond the scrubland before dawn. Others claimed she vanished into the interior, carried away by those who believed she belonged to something larger than chains or land. The truth fractured with time, splitting into versions that contradicted one another, yet all felt possible. That uncertainty was her final act. A clean ending would have comforted them. She denied them that. Stories replaced records. Mothers warned their children not to mock fire, not to assume obedience from things that burn. Laborers spoke of Esperanza in low voices, not as a saint, not as a monster, but as proof that suffering could be shaped into something deliberate. The furnace house became a place people passed quickly, eyes forward, hearts alert. Even when cold, it seemed to breathe. Years later, when ash from the furnaces drifted across the fields at dusk, some claimed they could hear sounds within it, not screams, not voices, but a steady presence, patient and aware. Fire still consumed what it was given, but it no longer felt owned. It felt borrowed, and borrowed things everyone knew could always be taken back.